It's very easy, I think, in the absence of connection to imagine the people in some far off place being basically alien. They have totally different concerns from yours and different priorities. And and they probably hate you and you'd probably hate them. And then like you hear a little bit of their music and you're like, oh, but their music is good. And then like you eat the weird version of bread they have, and you're like, oh, that's delicious. Okay, they can't be totally alien. So from the sort of survival of humanity as a goal, I think music is uniquely powerful in connecting people, and that's part of the reason why having it all online connected together is transformational, because now you can hear stuff from anywhere. Anybody that you think you're afraid of, guess what? They have hip hop, and you can go listen to their hip hop and be like, I don't know what they're saying, but that's dope.
Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Mr. Glenn McDonald, data alchemist and author of You Have Not Yet Heard Your Favorite Song. Glenn, wonderful to have you on today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So, Glenn, tell us, why this book?
Well, so I was at Spotify for a really long time, and I am a thoughtful person who thinks about why they're doing the things that they do and reads other people's opinions about how the things I do should be done. So I read a lot about streaming from a lot of perspectives. And my experience was most of those perspectives were either people with grudges or journalists with not much information, most of which they got from talking to people with grudges. And not that necessarily all the things that those people had grudges about were wrong, but there was always a lot more to things than that. And in particular, although many of the companies involved in streaming have lots of corporate flaws that are reasonable to talk about, I felt like streaming as a cultural phenomenon was like maybe the greatest use of the internet. And I really wanted someone to tell the story of streaming and the various things that go on around it from the point of view of actually believing there was a good thing here happening. And eventually I realized that no one else was going to do it. And so I had to do it myself.
Always kind of fun when you get to write the book that you just see this glaring need for. And you also do... I almost forgot to mention, you also do everynoise.com, correct? And that's an awesome project. So I'd love to talk about that at some point, which really, I think, showcases what you love about streaming. And so talk to us a little bit about when we talk about this movement from physical media. My brother's a big LP collector, and I think you talk about like fetishization, which I'll definitely mention at the next family dinner. What is the movement from physical media to streaming? What have been some of the big consequences?
I mean, to me, the biggest change is in discovery. That finding new music when I was a kid was a shopping experience. Like the place that had new music was the record store, and it was like pressed onto plastic and wrapped in cardboard, and the cardboard was wrapped in plastic again, just to be sure that you couldn't hear it. And I would just pick up these albums and go, I wonder what this is. I wish I could know. And streaming has not only changed that. I mean, like initially the iTunes store virtualized that shopping experience, but it was still a shopping experience. Like you still browsed through a store, made your purchase decisions, and then you could listen to your little library. And the big change in streaming is there is a library technically, but it's just for convenience and organization. It's not for access. So suddenly all the music in the world plenty of asterisks behind that
Yes.
all, but more than you can ever listen to in your lifetime,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
is just there, and you can explore it by listening, not by wondering. And to me, that's a great thing.
One of the things that, as you talk about the Apple thing, it's like, oh, you can discover more. You definitely have a broader selection, but still a shopping experience. And I think about the difference between getting, because I remember how fascinating that was to me that I could go listen to a 30-second sample on Apple. But immediately, the difference between that and streaming comes up. The difference between The Kinks, You Really Got Me Going, a 30-second sample, and Roundabout by Yes, a 30-second sample. Like those are like, or even a classical song that's like, not that, that probably wouldn't cost anything per se, but like you have a 15-minute song and you have a 30-second sample, and you have a 2-minute, three verses and a chorus, boom, done song. It's still very different from listening to the whole thing.
Yeah, actually, one like interesting sub project we had at the Echo Nest was trying to pick those 30 seconds in the smartest way possible, because there are there's 30 seconds. You have a lot of choices for where to get 30 seconds of Tales from Topographic Oceans, and many of them won't give you any sense of what the other 3 hours of that thing are like, but some of them do. And so that was fun. But still, like, the 30-second sample forces you into audit mode. Like, you can't
Yes.
sit back. You just can't sit back and listen to a bunch of 30-second samples, even if you have a mechanism for stringing them together. So it just keeps you in this shopping mode where you're just constantly making decisions and you're not really appreciating things.
Yeah, and I think there is a huge difference in our approach to art when we approach it as something like a judgmental, right? It's like, okay, impress me. There's a completely different stance between sitting and talking to a stranger at a coffee shop and talking to a car salesman, right?
Yes.
And it's like, I flipped around. It should have said car salesman first to keep it consistent, but it's like this idea of like, you go into a timeshare thing because they'll give you, my parents always try to get me to go to those high pressure, like timeshare thing where they'll give you something just for going, and you just resist it the whole time. And I'm like, honestly, I just rather not have the thing. That's a totally different stance from just being at the coffee shop and you're talking to someone and you're like, you know what? I'm not going to really pay attention anymore. I'm like going to let the conversation die out, or I'm going to move. That's totally like, there's a difference in openness. I mean, depends on, how friendly of a person you are, I guess. But we have different kinds of listeners too.
Yeah, I mean, the 30-second sample based experience of music is like all your interpersonal relationships being speed dating. Just
yeah,
like, hi, I'm glad to meet you, and now I will try to form a judgment about you as fast as possible. Like, that's not a way to fall in love. It's not even a way to like have an interesting conversation for a minute, never mind 30 seconds.
So you kind of mentioned this polemical, grudge-driven narrative around a lot of streaming. And I appreciate you're very honest that some of that's, legitimate. Some of those grudges are legitimate. But what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you're trying to correct in your book as someone who sees streaming as overall a positive thing?
Well, I mean, sort of the most existential one is all of the corporations that control the major streaming platforms and most of the music that gets on them they're capitalist entities. They're basically interchangeable in moral value. Like Spotify was a slightly more progressive than average company in employment terms, just in American employment terms, just from having started in Sweden. But it's just it's a normal corporation. Like, it's not worse or better than Apple or Amazon or Google, all of which have easily accessible long lists of things that could cause you to have reservations about them. And I wanted Spotify to be better than that, but it was not really in a position to be better than that. Like it is embedded in the music industry power structure. It couldn't go into business without licensing music from major labels, which are themselves giant capitalist inherently exploitative companies. So they're just never going to get revolution that way. Revolution, if it comes, is going to come from somewhere on the margin. Somebody is going to do something that initially seems minor and like it's only changing a little bit of something, and then gradually you realize that it's made some fundamental difference. It can't come from the center. And I wanted it to, and I could imagine, I could always imagine the emails that Daniel Ek could send if he were me. But you don't get to be a billionaire CEO of a major corporation by being a sort of socialist anarchist like I am. And so it was never going to happen. I was never going to get the emails like, guys, we've gotten off track. We're here to make musicians' lives better. And I'm hereby canceling all positions that we've taken that are against that. It's just like, yeah.
Okay, so I think that's there's a great segue here to talk about, and I love the way you end the book, connecting music with connection and joy. And so for you as a socialist anarchist,
I just made that up. I'm not really. I'm actually not really an anarchist.
Okay,
it's appealing.
I was yeah. I was running with it. So but what you want is for Spotify to focus on the music. And the reason for that is you think that you are spreading connection and joy. Can you talk a little bit about how music spreads connection and joy, what you see as kind of should be the priority in this sort of tech and music space? Because it could move, I don't know how it would change from streaming, but to be honest, when I was putting CDs in, I didn't see how it could get better, and that's because I just wasn't thinking about it, right? So I don't know what the next step is in music, but in the tech and music space, if we view joy and connection as the point of music, what do you see? How do we prioritize that? And why should we prioritize that?
Well, those are, of course, related questions. There's an inherent why if you just believe, as I do, that music is the thing that humans do best. That therefore, there should be more of it. Like everything should be oriented to have there be more music because we kind of suck at all the other things. Varying degrees.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to need you to defend that. I'm on board. Can you explain that to me? I've never thought of music as the thing we do best. So please.
Even bad music is pretty good, whereas bad urban design is terrible. Bad politics are terrible. To me, it's like music and then food, and then it's not a huge. There are other things that are sort of close, but and music and food get to the other way to think about the value of music, even if you don't consider it a goal in itself. Those two things, to me, are the best tools we have for overcoming difference, for convincing, allowing you to see the humanity in someone who is unfamiliar to you. It's very easy, I think, in the absence of connection to imagine the people in some far off place being basically alien. They have totally different concerns from yours and different priorities. And and they probably hate you and you'd probably hate them. And then you hear a little bit of their music and you're like, oh, but their music is good. And then you eat the weird version of bread they have and you're like, oh, that's delicious. Okay, they can't be totally alien. So from the sort of humanity, survival of humanity as a goal, I think music is uniquely powerful in connecting people. And that's part of the reason why having it all online connected together is transformational, because now you can hear stuff from anywhere. Anybody that you think you're afraid of, guess what? They have hip hop, and you can go listen to their hip hop and be like, I don't know what they're saying, but that's dope.
So it humanizes other people. And I think I love that you said overcoming difference. If I understand you correctly, there are other ways of overcoming difference, but what music and food, maybe storytelling sounds like it could fit in there, but I'm curious what you think of that. But that it's overcoming difference without conquering difference.
Right. I mean, it bypasses your rational like fears, aversions. That's why storytelling doesn't really, because you have language problems. And so the fact that both music and food, like you can understand the taste of something without being able to understand what the word for it is. And you can listen to music and enjoy it before the singing starts. And you can, if you're most people, I think you can enjoy it even when the singing starts if it's not in your language.
That's interesting. And that makes sense why you would, that is able to transcend that difference quickly and easily, right? It's much easier to learn to enjoy. That makes sense to me. Okay. And am I right in understanding that you see that value of when you're talking about overcoming difference, it's connecting without conquering? Is that a?
Yeah, although I mean, connecting is the beginning of empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. Because your goal is not to, when you talk about overcoming difference, it's not to make everybody the same. It's to, and that's where like, there's definitely people who are like, oh, we're going to overcome difference. They'd agree with you on that. And their goal is to assimilate people. And you're like, no, that's it. I mean, when we talk about every noise at once, every noise.com that you have, that's the whole point of that is to keep the difference. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's important to you?
Yeah. And it's sort of funny because in many things in life, we are trying to overcome, we're trying to do exactly what you said. We're trying to overcome bias. We're trying to reach like some sort of moral and human equilibrium between you and I, or you and I and some third weird person that we're about to encounter. And most of what I did with music data was not trying to overcome bias, but in fact trying to like capture it, trying to represent it correctly. Like what is it that this group of what are the groups of people in the world based on music or anything else, and what is it that distinguishes them? What is interestingly different about them? And so most of the things that seem like bias are personality or cultural community personality.
Or not as important once you get a chance to sit down and listen to their music and eat their food. And I like
it depends on what you mean by important. It's like not as, you don't need to judge them. You can appreciate them without judging them. Like you can learn what the flavors of a cuisine are without the first filter being, do I like this better than Cinnabon? It's like, there's a different thing. Like, taste it for what it is.
And do you think, and part of what you're doing with every noise at once is that you are teaching people to have that openness? Because when you talk about the empathy, that is, do you see that as something that you are encouraging or training? Because there's some people who be like, why would I do that? I know what I like. And it's, I think you said it's like 80s radio is like the default for your taste because that's just what you grew up with. And some people are like, I'm stuck on this and that's good enough. Do you feel that do you see what your work is encouraging and training that kind of openness?
I prefer to think of it as more facilitating.
Facilitating.
Like if you want to just listen to the things you loved when you were 16, that's I think it's a loss for you, but it's your call. And it's not really my mission to badger everybody out of their comfort zones in anything. That person who listens to only the music they liked when they were 16, may have some other dimension of their life in which all the newness and tension is channeled, and they need this comfort to balance that. And there are probably things in my life that I don't push because, to balance out the constant influx of weird noises. But what I wanted to do was, if you get curious, it should be easy to follow your curiosity. It should be easy and rewarding to follow your curiosity.
Yes.
And I hope that encourages people to be more curious, or it leads to people being more curious. But I'm not trying to badger people into doing it against their will.
So I mentioned that you had this cool website as I was reading your book, and my wife was working across from me. And all of a sudden I hear just the strangest sounds coming from her computer. And I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, this website's pretty cool. So I do it. Like, I think, anyways, we can get to that at the end. Is like, what should someone do after listening to this podcast besides buying your book and reading and understanding? Is also to visit the website and to explore a little bit. What are some of the, you use two different axes to organize everything, and you use kind of abstract ones so that you'll have weird clusters. Can you talk about how you organize every noise at once?
Yeah, it is the front page of everynoise.com is a sort of map of all the genres in the world that we had identified by the time I eventually got laid off from Spotify, which is 6,500 or something. And they are laid out geometrically on the page, algorithmically, not by me moving them around, but just by math. And the two axes from top to bottom is a thing we called mechanism. So the things at the top are synthetic instrumentation and mechanical timing. Like the space between every two beats is super consistent, like tech house. And as it goes down the page, the instrumentation gets more acoustic and the timing gets more fluid and human until you get to the bottom and you have things like classical piano, where the part of the performance is like manipulating the exact duration between two notes, and you're very gradually speeding up and slowing down. And then the horizontal dimension on the left are very dense sounds, like constant roar or constant hum, where there's like not a lot of variations, like satanic black metal, but also classical organ and it's like box fan noise. And then on the right is like jumpier, bouncier, spikier sounds, or space between the notes, and the volume goes up and down. So hip hop and reggae over there, but also like people like political speeches and people reading poems aloud and other stuff like that. And everything gets, the way that page works is just a big XY plot, and then there's some fiddly code that bumps out all the words around until they're not sitting on top of each other, so you can actually read them. And then the colors, because it's in color, and the red, green, and blue channels are three more acoustic attributes similar to those. And honestly, I could look up what they are, but I didn't pick them I just picked them because they produced a color scheme that kind of made sense. So you can look at the page and see patterns of color across the XY space. Like there's blue that unifies things with sort of a glassy ambient tone, whether they're dancey, glassy ambient, or like chill, abstract, glassy ambient. And if you see two things right next to each other, you think, oh, those are probably pretty similar. But if they're different colors, then that gives you a way to think, oh, they're similar in some ways, but they're different in some other ways. So,
and am I right in thinking, because it seems like classical music, when you talk about the density, like you have Bach organ music, that's going to be very dense. When you have like, I think it's Stravinsky's Firebird, right? Like I think of that kind of famous clip that went around with the woman screaming because the bump, there's that famous like almost jump scare in the middle of it. And that's kind of spikier. That would be actually over, even though it's still classical. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, the map is aggregating those values at the level of genres. So,
okay.
So that would, all those symphonic composers are going to be, all their work is going to be combined together for a classical value. But then there's like classical organ, which is only averaging together just the organ music. That's going to be over on one side. And then like harpsichord is inherently like spikier, so that's going to be somewhere else.
Bagpipes are going to be over on the dense side. A lot of droning, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
And when you're organizing genre, one of the things I found interesting is you talked about the way that it's not, there is the mathematical stuff, but you can see these genres have strange pairings when you do it according to acoustic qualities. And that's not what makes them genres. What makes them genres is generally a history and a community. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what the discovery of that has been like? And if you wanted to share, I love that you got in trouble with the Dream fandom for Minecraft for literally naming their genre, and they loved it, but they didn't want to admit that they loved it. I think I found that really fascinating.
That whole episode was fascinating. But yeah, I started the project because I was at the Echo Nest and we were trying to make a business doing recommendations for streaming services like backend radio and other recommendation things. And we kept having potential customers that wanted genre radio. This is the era of Pandora. So yes, the online radio models were basically song or artist based. But there were a bunch of business people who were like, no, I don't want to have people have to figure out that stuff. Just like give me 8 buttons, like rock, jazz, blues, something. And we didn't actually have that. And we told someone we did, and then we had to go make it really quickly. And that was the beginning. So I didn't begin. It wasn't an academic exercise. It was like, all right, how can I get a bunch of plausibly responsive rock music hooked up to a button as fast as possible? And having done that, then I was like, well, how many of these things are there? And it wasn't until fairly well into that process that I even had a moment to stop and think, wait, what is it that I'm really doing here? And I think a lot of people have a view of genre that it's a set of musical parameters, like ragtime. It has this certain meter, certain instrumentation, certain structural characteristics. And it's true that ragtime is a genre, and it's true that most of the music in it does have those common elements, but that is not what made it a genre. It made it a genre as people. And for me, that was the breakthrough that allowed me to figure out where to go beyond the first 100, and even to understand why the first 100 was the first 100. Like, all genres are formed from human community. They're communities of practitioners or listeners or both, usually both, but not always. And it is the people that define them. And I was reminded of this many, many times over the years since, as I raised a child and would have to explain punk, and just explaining why the Stranglers and the Damned, which I, of course, having grown up with them, understood to be punk, were punk, even though they didn't sound like the Sex Pistols, and they certainly didn't sound like Green Day. But it wasn't existential. I mean, the answer was really simple. Like, this thing called punk began, in London, these people, these streets, these clothing stores, these shows. Oh, and then it started again in New York and again in LA. And in each time, it was a bunch of people, and it became whatever those people did initially. And once they've done it, then, the next generation comes along and has a thing they already think that word means. So if you started a punk band in 1981, that was a very different thing than starting a punk band in 1976, because you were trying to do a thing that already existed. And there's a part in the book where I go through like the inevitable cycles and divisions and rebellions.
Yes.
Each one of these things go through, because then having all the new generation comes in and makes their version, but they already know what they think it's supposed to sound like, and then someone gets pissed off that no, you didn't capture the original spirit, and then you get neo whatever it is, and then everybody gets pissed
Neo-punk,
off.
post-punk. Yeah.
Yeah. Like everything goes through. They don't always use the same terminology, but that's what happens with communities over time. Like they spin around and they divide and recoalesce and land somewhere else. Like that's all very human, and that's how genres develop and evolve. And yeah,
And it's
once I understood that, then I understood. Oh, I'm just trying to find all the listening communities on the planet, and so I'm probably never going to find them all, but it is at least notionally finite. Like eventually we run out of people. At least in theory.
Yes, at least in theory. And of course, it does get complicated because people belong to more than one listening community, too.
Yeah. And that was another thing very early on. Like every other attempt at modeling genres, pretty much at the time, was done as a tree. And so it's like, well, the top, there's classical and rock and jazz and pop. But wait, is rock pop? But jazz was pop. And it's you quickly can get yourself tied into useless knots at that level. But then once you get down below, if it's a strict hierarchy, then it's hopeless, because what do you do with pop rap? Is that a form of pop or is it a form of rap? And you could pick one, but if you're like a Spotify business manager and you're trying to do stats by genre, and your whole dashboard changes color if you make a different decision about whether Drake is pop or rap, then like that's chaotic and useless. So my version of it was all genres are data-wise atomic, independent. Artists can be in multiple of them. You belong to multiple communities. You belong to your physical community, but also your Scrabble nerd community and everything else. That's very normal. Communities, they overlap, they subsume each other, they are defined by history, by place, by lyrical propensity, by how many bagpipes they have or don't have, like all these kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I want to talk to you about how we could be more responsible with the algorithms that find these things and why that's important. But before we do that, I think it would help people to understand the and not that, like I want to be careful about the word failure here, but you had some great stories about engineering failure and engineering surprises that I think could help people understand how what algorithms can do and what they can't do, and that'll help inform our discussion about algorithms. Can you give some of your favorite stories about some of the more interesting failures in your engineering and some of your favorite surprises?
So the early on at the Echo Nest, so before we did the genre stuff, even the kind of layer beneath that was artist similarity. So like one of the main things we were doing at the Echo Nest was scraping all the pages that we could find on the web that said anything about music, trying to figure out what bands or artists they were talking about, and then assess word frequency. So you could say, if the people use the word reggae a lot to describe Bob Marley, and they use other words too, but that one really stands out. Like there's a lot of wealth of information that people have expressed in an unruly but evocative way by typing onto the web. And we had a thing that would look for patterns of those terms and say, if these two artists share words that describe them, they're probably similar. And you can do that without even looking at what the words are. And one of the things that we did as I was looking at the code early in my time at the Echo Nest was I realized we were breaking apart multi-word phrases into individual words. And this like rock and roll turned into rock and roll. But when people say rock and roll, they actually mean something different than when they say rock. Rock and roll is a particular historic phrase, and it's really useful to retain that. And so I just made a quick little fix that kept the phrases together. And I don't know, in my memory, like 30 seconds after I committed that, the founder stormed over to my table and was like, never mess with that. I'm like, what's wrong? It's clearly better this way. He's like, no. And he like pulled up Justin Bieber on my screen, and where Justin Bieber's most similar artists a minute ago were all very reasonable. Now it was this weird set of people I'd never heard of. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I broke the system. And so I reverted it, and he like took a deep breath and walked away. And I was like, but why? And at the time, this is before Spotify, so we didn't have any listening data, any direct listening data. So all we had were these words and tags that we scraped. And we scraped stuff from Last FM, which allowed people to put their own tags on music. And one of those tags was a long phrase that included some homophobic sentiment that I don't remember and won't reproduce. But it had something to do with like San Francisco and sweaters and caramel lattes. It was like a very ill meaning but a hilarious long phrase. And some person had gone and tagged Justin Bieber and like a bunch of other people that were otherwise unknown. And none of those words were interesting on themselves. So if you broke them apart, like sweater, I know sweater is not, but when you put them back together, that phrase was only ever used in the entire world on Last FM to describe these 20 artists, and totally screwed up our thing. I mean, I found a way to fix it by looking at if it only occurs 20 times in the world, then that's cool, but also a little bit of a reason for suspicion. So with enough intelligent math, you can get the good signal out of things without being screwed up by the perverse, abusive tagging some people do.
This came up, I almost mentioned this earlier when you were talking about punk, neo-punk, post-punk, whatever, punk core, whatever. When you're talking about communities, sometimes people are defined as much that people are often defined by what they love, but they're often also as much defined by what they hate, which seems a little bit against what you're trying to do with Every Noise at Once, but it's what you're running into sometimes. Like people wouldn't be offended if you said that punk was similar to, Belarusian hip hop. They'd be like, what do you mean? They ask it, but you're like, no, neopunk is just like post-punk. I'm sure, and I'm obviously just creating those labels, but people be like, no, we're not, because there's that history there, right?
The closer they are to each other, the more likely everybody on either side cares about the exact imaginary boundary between them.
Well, and that's the same thing with like somebody had a believer in their life. Right? Like that's like definitely like the only reason you do that is because something about Justin Bieber had been like thrust in your face and you didn't want it to go and to seek that out. Anyways, I do love it's surprising in the math to find all the humanists, right? I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but it is.
I mean, it's the goal, of course. And it got our ability to find, so that data set looked very interesting. It looked very human because every artist then had this long list of words with the declining weights. And so you could sort of get a non-grammatical description of each artist from it.
Yeah.
And then when we got acquired by Spotify, finally we had firsthand listening data. And so we knew what everybody listens to all the time, and we could find patterns of shared listeners. That turned out to be just exponentially better for actually finding similarity, even though it didn't produce anything intelligible in the same way. Like it only produced descriptions of artists in terms of other artists. And so it lacks, at least in a technical sense, a bunch of the information that people have. Like you listen to these three bands. Why do you listen to those three bands? Because they're all Estonian metal bands and you like Estonian metal. And it turns out that you can make much better recommendations for people if you know that they like these three bands without knowing why, than if you know why but you don't know what they actually listen to.
What they actually listen to.
And it's because humans don't listen randomly. So your listening encodes everything you love and hate. So, like, if you hate the Red Hot Chili Peppers, you will be, among the relative minority of people who are exposed to bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, but have a notable absence of Red Hot Chili Peppers in their listening. And so you can find those patterns.
There was one story in particular, if you don't mind sharing, about surprising algorithmic. You were trying to find Christmas music, which is one of the more difficult things you run into. And you thought there was something wrong because you kept getting huge Christmas responses in September for, I think it was the Philippines and for Saudi Arabia. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah. So the first year I did it, I had this idea. If you work in music recommendations, you have to worry about Christmas because nobody wants Christmas recommendations outside of those 2 weeks before Christmas. And then for 2 weeks, everybody wants at least to be able to get Christmas recommendations. So despite being a person who tried to ignore Christmas music as much as possible for my entire adult life, I became involuntarily fascinated with it to be able to filter it out and in. And so I did at one point this thing, which you can still see the last state of on Every Noise, called the Approaching Worms of Christmas. And it was a measure by country of what percentage of that country's listening by day was Christmas music. Whole interesting sub-project of how you know it's Christmas music. But so I'd done this for a few years, and every year it was like a race to see whether Iceland or Norway or Sweden or the Netherlands would come out on top. And so like all the Scandinavian countries would start earlier than the rest of Europe and the US and end up higher. And so I would turn it off after Christmas and not think about it until August when I turned it on again. And so one year I turned it on again in August and just sort of ignored it until it was into September, and I could go back and look at how things were doing. And it looked like it had the previous years, except there was this one line that just went way up on September 1st, like sharply overnight on September 1st, and then stayed high long before I knew any substantial portion of Scandinavia was listening to Christmas music. And I'm like, crap, I definitely screwed something up in the processing of this thing, and spent a good half hour at least, maybe more, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. And finally I was like, I can't find it. What is that? What is that line? Because I just had little country codes on them. So I'm like, wait, PL, what is that? PH? I don't remember what it was, but it was the Philippines. And I'm like, no, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. Like the Philippines is nowhere near the Vatican. Like they can't be listening to Christmas music. And then having still failed to figure out what my error was, I started doing a little Googling. I'm like, oh, actually, they like Christmas music in the Philippines. And then like 2 hours of weird articles later, I'm like, Christmas music has a formal season in the Philippines, and it starts on September 1st. And if you're listening to it would be bad if I'd put individual names on that thing, because you don't want to out the people who had jumped the gun and begun listening to Christmas music in the Philippines on August 31st, because that is not done. But September 1st, season opens. And yeah, as you alluded, the next year when I started it up and went to look to see if everything was, the Philippines were still their weird selves, there were 3 lines, and I'm like, oh no, now what if I screwed up? But yeah, the next 2 were the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and another hour of Googling later, I had a better understanding of the overseas Filipino worker population, which is a giant demographic phenomenon that millions of people participate in and know about, and I didn't, and that's how I learned about it. But yeah, the Philippines had gotten Spotify long before UAE, and hundreds of thousands of Filipino workers had gone to build World Cup stadiums and shopping malls and whatever else in Dubai, and they'd brought their relatively cheap exchange rate Spotify subscriptions with them. And so when I went and looked at the charts in UAE around Christmas, it was like mostly Filipino Christmas music. And then, number 6 would be something in Arabic. And then number 10 would be something in Arabic. And I'm like, oh, it's so life affirming that these people are able to love both this Arabic religious music and this Christian. And then, of course, when you dig into it, you find, no, it's not that. They're two separate populations coexisting at once. And the Arabs are not listening to Christmas music, and the Filipinos are not listening to Diwali, whatever the.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I loved it. So it had the structure of a joke, because you're like, oh no, what have I messed up this time? I'm like, you're like, I know in Philippines you could have like a Christian influence, but I'm like, I know for a fact that Saudi Arabia is majority Muslim. Where is this coming from? And you're like, oh, there's Filipinos there, like they came over.
Which in this anecdote was a predictable punchline, but
yes,
at the time as I started trying to figure out why UAE was up there, I didn't realize that it was the same thing I discovered the previous year, but just in a different form.
And I love it. Like, there is a little bit of a detective novel feel to reading that. Like, what is happening here? And I think that leads us to, because you're doing a lot of cultural digging to affirm what you're finding. And I think that leads to the one of the main questions I wanted to ask you. And I think you give a really great recommendation. You can talk about directly to this as someone who's worked on this kind of stuff. The difference between quality and metrics driven algorithms, and why one is more responsible than the other. Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, I mean, everything I did basically at Spotify was generate something, playlist, lists of artists, pictures, whatever, and then run it on a lot of different things and look at the results and try to figure out whether they're good or not. And I mean, I got into this business because I was a music geek and I knew a bunch of stuff about music. And very quickly in the process of learning more about music, I realized how little I knew about music. But at least I knew how to figure things out about music. So, I could produce a list of German hip hop, and I didn't know anything about German hip hop, but give me half an hour and I could be like, all right, so most of this is clearly German hip hop, but some of it is not German, or some of it's not in German, and some of it is not hip hop. And that gives me stuff I can Google. And, as a person who's read hundreds of thousands of articles about music, maybe I'm slightly faster at deciphering them than someone who hasn't, but more, I just care. Like, really, that was the difference. It wasn't I was smarter or had more expertise. I just really cared more. So I would just gnaw at that generator until its German hip hop list was all German and all hip hop. And in the process of doing that, I would discover, 9 other things around German hip hop in the course of learning to filter them out. And so that's how I did everything. And there is a lot of stuff in technology and recommendations in particular that is not done that way. It's done with machine learning. It's done with automated processes that ultimately respond. They're still fed by human inputs, by listening and by people making playlists and whatever, but they are not iterated by experts or even fans looking at individual results and trying to make them be different. They're iterated by measuring some wholesale effect. Like instead of trying to make the German hip hop playlist good, the ML approach would be just generate a playlist for everything, ship them to 10% of the listeners, and then measure how much time people spend listening and compare that figure for the people who got the new algorithm to that figure for the people who got the old algorithm. And that is not a crazy way. Like, that's not a crazy way to proceed. That works at some holistic level, but it doesn't. It misses so much nuance. Like if you run that test and you find, all right, things went up 0.25%, then the human thing to ask is what really happened? Did every genre get 0.25% better? Does that even make sense? What would it be to be a core? Like we're giving people 3-minute songs. Did we give them 3-minute, 5-second songs? Like how could a song be 0.25% more applicable? Like it doesn't make sense. So then you dig and you'd find, oh, no, actually, most things stayed the same. A couple genres got much better, or people listened to them for much longer, which is not always the same as much better. And then like a bunch of them got worse. And if you care, you'd be like, well, that's promising, but also bad. And let's go see if we could figure out what was good about the good ones and what was bad about the bad ones and make it so that we make everything better, or at least something's better without making other things worse. But if your priorities and your personality is not that, and you just like, you see the figure, we went up by 0.25%, ship it, move on to the next project, then that's how things insidiously get worse, because that number hides a much more complex situation. And often that number is just misleading. Like it measures something, but the advantage disappears when you run it again, or it turns out that it's some spurious variation. Like I remember we ran a test once, and I was sure that it wasn't going to make any difference. Just sure from my perspective as a music listener that whatever we were changing didn't make any difference. But one of them was dramatically better in the results. And I was so irritated by that I went and dug into it and found that in setting up the test, we had accidentally, like there was a filter in the real version that excluded super short songs. And we'd forgotten to put that filter on the test set. And we were measuring by how many songs people listened to. So all that had really, like, we hadn't improved anything. We'd just basically taken the same results, not filtered out short songs. And then those people who got short songs ended up listening to more songs in the same amount of time. And we were like, victory, we've increased the number of songs people listen to. Like, no, that was not victory at all.
Yeah. And didn't you run it again and it was either negligible or actually the new one was worse? I can't remember. I remember reading the story.
I'm sure we had all three possible over time.
Yes.
In the book, to placate Spotify lawyers, I often combined elements of things so as not to reveal any nominal secrets. And I think in that case, there are really a couple of different experiments that I was describing, but yeah, we often found that yes, the thing that you think got better is worse or no different, or it's actually, or even maybe when you remove the thing that screwed up, it actually is better, but you weren't measuring that correctly before. You just don't know.
Yes, and I do think there is something here too. Is that one of the things you talked about is that just measuring attention or just measuring time can be problematic, and if you're doing that just for like 1 to 5 changes or even to 100 changes, you might see improvement. But am I right in thinking that over 1,000 changes or 10,000 changes or even longer, like over years of doing this, you will eventually, it'd be very easy to get a worse result than if you had this more quality, more curated approach, because of the way it kind of compounds.
If you're not really scrutinizing what changes, then yeah, you're probably changing some things that you don't realize. And the more changes you make, the more random, unintended consequence things are happening around the margins. And those build up. And then by the time you get to your 1,001st change, it enters this world that has all these accumulated weirdnesses, and sometimes just ends up triggering one of them. So you have some problem that you really introduced 2 years ago and it was tiny at the time, but it just sits there lurking until later when some seemingly unrelated change suddenly triggers it. Like those little 5-second clips didn't matter because some other thing filtered them out. Like this thing that made radio didn't include anything that was less than a minute and a half. But then 3 years from now, you have to re-implement this. And so you're writing this radio thing over from scratch with some other technical back end. And no one who's doing it was on the original team. And they forget that filter. And suddenly their radio is filled with all this crap. And you're like, what? I didn't do this. And you're like, you didn't do it. Like those things, that flaw was introduced 3 years ago. Those tracks have been sitting there for 12 years and never bothered anybody. But now you stepped in it.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm trying to think of the way that beyond just music, but the way that algorithms can work is that a lot of times the people who are most affected, and you won't necessarily see a drop until they've been gone for a while, are like your power users. Like the people who are making playlists on Spotify for free are some of the first to be bothered by some changes, and you won't see they actually bring a lot of good to the platform, and you won't see the problems of losing them until later on, until after they've gone and it's been some time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And that's one, but hardly the only case of slow effects.
Yeah.
Or, things that you only experience like a couple generations later. Like we're in the middle of a particularly dangerous one now in technology where we're filling the web with AI generated stuff that then is hard to tell the difference between that and the human generated stuff, and then feeds back as training into the next generation of AI. So when you do that the first time,
it looks great.
It's like, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. And then you're like, oh, but now I'm worried about it 2 months later. So you test it again. You're like, nah, still seems fine. And then you stop testing. Because I checked twice and it was fine. And then you're not watching as it gradually goes crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, as a really dumb example, and I'm sure that they test better than this. I'm sure engineers wouldn't make this mistake at all because they don't make silly mistakes ever.
No.
But like the finger thing that was going through with AI, where like they would add like it'd be like 3 fingers instead of 4 fingers, or it'd be 6 fingers instead of 5 fingers, right? And if that gets put out on the web and then you train the AI on that again, then that problem will actually get worse, because before it was being trained on normal human hands, but now it's like, well, sometimes humans have 6 fingers because that's what I see on the web.
Yeah, I have this picture, right? I got a bunch of pictures of people with 6 fingers. It's very normal. So there are probably some with 7 later.
Right. So I want to be respectful of your time, and thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Where do we go from here? What do you see? What would you recommend for the consumer to do? But also, you have the consumer. Let's say the listener, so we don't have that shopping experience, right? The listener and the person, for the musician, and for the that person who makes it makes those connections possible. What do you see as some good next steps?
Yeah, so I'll go through them in reverse order.
Sure.
In my marching orders to the people like me who work on these things is to think about yourself as a steward of human culture. And anything that you're doing with math and data is interfering in a technical sense with human culture, and it is your responsibility to care what that does and try to figure out what you are doing and understand it and try to make it be an improvement in the world rather than a source of disintegration. I'll come to the artist last. For the listener, you don't have to do anything. It's not your job as a listener to fix the future. I hope you're trying to make the world better in some way, but music doesn't have to be it. Music can be your comfort, and then you go back to your job trying to cure cancer or purify water or make coffee or just whatever it is you're doing that you really that you're trying to make a difference with. It's fine. If you have the bandwidth, then I think being a curious listener and finding ways to take control of your listening experience and seek out things that you actually like, as opposed to just being satisfied with whatever some process feeds you based, loosely on what you already told it that you like. That's the way to be a responsible listener, both for the music industry's sake and for your own sake. For an artist, and I get asked this a lot, particularly in the form of like, how do I game the algorithm? What should I do to get the favor of the algorithm? And my answer is always none of that. Like, whatever you just listed, don't do that. Don't spend any time trying to second guess a streaming platform or an algorithm, because a bad thing that will happen is you won't succeed and you'll have wasted your time. But an even worse thing is you will concoct some elaborate strategy you think is working. You will have some success, which will almost certainly be coincidental, and you will attribute it to the like weird superstitious thing. Oh, all album covers should have a big orange circle somewhere in the background. And I did that, and my song got 612 streams, where all my old ones only had 30. And so now every cover after that must have a orange circle in the background. And mysteriously, they never do well again, because that wasn't why. So you can waste a ton. And meanwhile, you spent all this time making orange circles, which didn't teach you anything about your music or your album covers or anything. So my recommendation to artists is always do the things you always knew you had to do. Like, you're trying to build audiences. If you are super famous, you can build a community that is just your fans. And if you are not Taylor Swift, you cannot. And so you need to be part of a community that exists for some reason other than you. And you need to have a place where you go away for 2 years to make an album and come back. There has to be a place somewhere to come back to, where people who have not been thinking about you, who may have loved you 2 years ago, but it's been a while. They're listening to other things. The world is big. You got to have some place where when you come back, somebody is like, oh, I remember these guys, and goes to the place where these people connect and be like, hey, you guys remember so-and-so? And everybody else is like, oh, yeah, now that you mentioned it, I do. They have a new album. Great. If you're Taylor, you just post it on, you go on Travis's podcast and you announce it, and the world spins out of control. But for most people, they don't have a famous NFL players podcast on which they can announce their albums.
Yeah, or the millions of dollars that's probably put into the marketing. And I think this goes back to what we talked about kind of near the beginning, that genres are really communities, right? And that's and understanding that. I think I know the answer. But besides buying and reading your book, which was a fun read and a fascinating read, and an easy read, which is always nice. I have a lot of philosophers on it. It's a nice break from, it's like, well, actually, when we're talking about Heidegger, and then there'll be a string of German words, which I can't read off the top of my head. I'm like trying to sound it out. Anyways, thank you.
I read a lot of academic papers about music and streaming the business too. And I was definitely not trying to write one of those.
Yeah. So besides reading your very, I definitely got off track there. Oh, that was some definitely repressed trauma. No, besides reading your very clear, fun book, and informative too, what is something you'd recommend to someone who has listened to this podcast for the last hour? What would you have them do? Or would you have them meditate on? Or what would you tell them to go listen to? I was going to ask, how much did you get paid to do that plug for Icarus, the best song ever?
Flight of Icarus.
Yes.
They're great. I got paid nothing.
Yeah. What would you tell someone to do after listening to this podcast?
Well, after listening to this podcast, you should immediately swear off podcasts forevermore and devote all all this time you've wasted listening to people like us just talk at you and spend it listening to music.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, there you go. We solved it.
Sorry.
No. Oh, but I think there is definitely some like, go find something new to listen to, right? Like go to every noise at once, click around a little bit, find something you enjoy, and then go listen to more of it on a streaming service.
You're living in the best time for discovering music that there has ever been up till this point. So don't miss it. Music is the thing humans do best, and you can be convinced of that too.
Yes, I love it. That's a great way to end. I think we start with that, we end with it. Thank you. An absolute joy having you on today.
Thanks.